The Intel Atom. Nowadays they're not actually too bad, with them having low TDPs as well as decent performance, and they sort of make sense in the devices they're in. But back before they became good, just how well did they perform? This right here is a netbook, but we don't actually care about that. What we do care about is what's actually inside, which is the Intel Atom N450, a CPU that clocks in at 1.66 GHz with one single core that actually has hyper-threading enabled, which was actually a selling point at the time. It also comes with integrated Intel GMA 3150 graphics, which boasted being a whole 2% faster than the preceding GMA 950, all while being much less supported in the community. So in other words, if you had a GMA 950, at least you could get support for it, whereas this thing, it's sort of left out on a limb. Now, the impressive thing about this CPU is that it does only use 5.5 watts, and that's under peak load, as it has an integrated memory controller as well as integrated GPU, meaning there isn't exactly much in the way of separate power-consuming components. In fact, it was even cheaper to shove this little CPU into netbooks than previous iterations. So if you didn't have one as weak as the one in my original netbook video, then chances are you had one of these in your netbook. It was never very good upon its initial release, but that hardly matters now, as it sold, and it sold rather well. So why don't we see how well this little chip with an arguably impressive TDP holds up nearly a decade later in 2019. So this is going to be a fairly standard configuration setup with 1GB of DDR2 800MHz RAM and a 300GB 7200 RPM hard drive, mainly because that's actually what came inside the netbook, and it's a little bit funny with anything over that amount of RAM, although it does technically support 2GB, but either way it's running in single channel. Not that that'll make much difference to this setup, as it is only a single core CPU and a GPU that is about as good as a half-grown potato. So why don't we see what this little setup can actually do and discuss what makes this actually somewhat interesting today. Now, what makes this weird little system interesting is that when you go out to the shops even today, you'll always see some bottom-of-the-barrel laptops and netbooks for sale. And what is the go-to CPU of choice? Well, nothing other than the Intel Atom, which is now acceptable with decent iGPU performance and not half bad speed when it comes to working as a system, or while using a mere 2 watts. But that is a modern day example. See, this is one of the last of the older Atoms. Slow, cheap, and frankly a reminder that people paid far too much for something that even struggled to run 480p video when it was released. But we bought them, and people bought them in droves, so nowadays these things can be picked up for pennies and can usually be picked up free because most people just throw them away, because they're mostly useless. Or are they? Now, we're going to be testing across 3 different operating systems: Windows 7 Starter, which is as basic as Windows 7 gets, Windows XP, which was still supported at the time these things were released, and Lubuntu, which is the Linux option, because if I don't test it, half of you in the comment section will be bashing me for not using it, so we are going to have a Linux option just to see how well it holds up on the netbook. But yes, we are going to do an in-depth evaluation on whether the Intel Atom is indeed a potato in terms of value and performance in 2019. First on our list, why don't we discuss gaming performance, because let's be honest, the main reason most of you are here is to see just how bad this thing holds up in gaming in 2019. But then again, let's be more honest and say that most 2019 titles aren't even going to start or run. So firstly, to kick things off, we would started with Counter-Strike Source running with the lowest possible options in the lowest normal resolution of 640x480, and we saw decent enough performance, if decent means a slideshow across all 3 operating systems. Linux was technically the best with a 12 FPS average, but all of them were equally as awful, and really showed just how poor the Intel Atom setup was for recent-ish titles of the time. But credit where credit's due, the chip did a blind sight better than the 2 FPS of the GMA 950 when I tested that, so I suppose you can give it some credit saying it's a better slideshow than previous iterations. Considering we weren't having much luck with CS Source, it made sense to move on to the next big thing, which of course was much older, but a benchmark that was staple for all graphics cards released in the hip year of 1999, around 10 years before this even came out. But to digress, Quake 3's time demo did actually run quite nice on the system, as all operating systems held a respectable average FPS of above 30, with Linux actually proving to run the nicest, which is no surprise given how praised this port is over on Linux. So for a little LAN machine, it's actually not doing half bad for an FPS from 1999, and you could lower the settings down, it might even be more competitive. So seeing how well our experience was with that era of FPS games, why don't we move forward onto GTA Vice City, which is a classic game and tends to run better than GTA 3, all while being less intensive than GTA San Andreas, and with an even better soundtrack personally. It was impressively smooth considering how low the system requirements are for this game, and virtually with the lowest graphics settings it was okay to look at, provided you used Windows XP, as both Windows 7 and Linux really weren't ideal. So it does seem that XP is a relatively good shout for most forms of gaming so far. So just how far can we push it with these types of third-person games? I mean, if GTA can start, then surely we should be able to start and possibly play something like Fable, which is beautiful in terms of optimization. But even then it wasn't really playable, with the Atom squeezing out single-digit frame rates regardless of the OS or settings used. As I'm running them on the lowest ones right here, it's just not off to a good start, and it's not exactly a good option if you want to play this game. But hey, I did suppose I said we'd try and find the limits of this and try and see just what it was capable of. But Fable, it clearly isn't. So we've established this era of games isn't exactly ideal. But where would we be without some more Source? Because of course, who doesn't love a bit of Half-Life 2, which was definitely a weird one as the game did run better than CS Source, which is odd. It wasn't exactly playable, with enough tweaks you could definitely get it running on a system like this, although it is worth noting that Windows 7, regardless of the drivers used, did have some weird graphical artifacting. Linux was fine, Windows XP was fine, and it was a very odd issue, you know, I haven't seen this before, at least not often, with Intel GMA chips, so it was odd that it was only happening on the Windows 7 starter operating system, which admittedly is not something I often use. Mountain Blade is definitely a favourite of mine when it comes to benchmarks because it is so customizable in terms of what you can run. So we chose the DirectX 7 renderer, which is usually capable of making this game run on an utter potato of a PC, which luckily the Atom is. So pushed to its very limits in the lowest possible settings in 640x480, we saw a semi-playable average of 24 FPS if you used Windows XP, as every other OS was hopeless, which wasn't ideal but still it did run on XP. Do keep in mind that the frame rates do include when the battles got smaller, and they were definitely more playable as they got smaller, but larger battles were completely out of the question, and I'd recommend sticking to smaller battle sizes if you were to even attempt this. And then finally you've got titles like RimWorld, where the game wasn't playable due to the lack of any real modern OpenGL support, and everything was purple, which is never great, even on Linux, which was apparently meant to have better OpenGL support. So yeah, you get the idea, smaller indie titles, although they start, they aren't exactly playable. And finally you've got like AAA titles from the early 2000s, so like Morrowind, which are open world titles, and they ran, but not well, so you get the idea. It's not exactly a capable chip for any open world titles or modern indie games. You really have to stick to those smaller closed-in experiences from the early 2000s if you want to get anything running on this card. So what did we find out? Well, the Intel Atom can't really gain, but this is meant to be a bit of appreciation of what it can do, or at least what it tried to do. For a little CPU and GPU combo, they ended up sucking 5.5 watts from the wall, and I've got to say, it's kind of impressive when you consider that 5.5 watts was able to do this on what is a very old architecture on one of the older Atoms. But how does 5.5 watts hold up in real usage, I hear you ask? Because at the end of the day, this is a netbook. So why don't we test it on things that matter, like the net in 2019, something that I doubt any of us thought would ever be said. So why don't we break this down into the first few categories. Firstly, you got speed and general usage, internet browsing, video playback, and then finally ease of use. Because we want to find out if this little CPU and GPU combo is actually worth your time, because gaming wise, well, it really wasn't, but maybe it can redeem itself here, hopefully. Across all three operating systems, well, it actually surprised me. Compared to the other Intel Atom chips that have the Intel GMA 950 chipset, this thing was actually quite nice to use. I mean, it was very smooth overall, and although multitasking was definitely a struggle, the hyperthreading did tend to be a godsend when it came to doing it. So despite the chip being ludicrously underpowered by modern standards, it does hold up somewhat okay. I mean, better than older versions that we've tested. It's not great, but it does work, and it's a lot smoother than some of those older Atoms, which are based on a similar architecture. Anyways, the same sort of thing extended to YouTube in that it worked, although in this case it was quite subpar. And although I found some people could actually get along with it, usually you have to target 360p, sometimes 240p on heavy forms of media, and 480p if you're using Linux. But even then, that wasn't for all forms of media. Overall, all these tests were done with the H.264 extension using Firefox, so this is the best you can get when it comes to YouTube playback, and you can kiss goodbye to using YouTube whatsoever without any extensions like that, because it just doesn't work. Any newer codecs, they won't work on a machine like this, and they will stutter all over the place. So really, yes, it kind of works for media consumption, but even back in the day, people said that unless you got a built-in decoder, because I think those were actually sold on some of these units, you know, there's no point having one of these machines. Anyway, other than that, we have the boot time test, which shows that Linux was the quickest, Windows XP was shortly followed up behind, and then struggling to make its way to the start screen was Windows 7. That's then again if it actually chose to load in, and I'm talking about loading here, as Windows 7 for some reason kept trying to update quite a lot, and I had to try and stop it from updating just so it would work for these tests. Now, a while ago what I wanted to do was actually start trying to stream from this Atom, and it was a royal pain in the arse but a good challenge, so I figured, why not make our last test? Can we stream from the Intel Atom? I know it sounds ridiculous, but we're going to try it anyway. So to start things off and even get this thing to even try and start streaming, OBS won't work, Bebo, which is an actually somewhat competent streaming service now, won't work. Most other clients are too intensive and don't in fact work, but you know what did work? XSplit. The only issue is, you can only go down to stupidly small resolutions if you pay for it. So I actually bought a license for the month, set the scale down to 240p, plugged in an Elgato, and we were able to stream some Red Dead Redemption 2 all the way from the Intel Atom, and it did end up alright. That is up until the end of the stream, where the stream's frame rate was suffering poorly, the picture was hardly being outputted, and even then audio was dropping. But we did indeed manage to get a bit of a game stream from this system. Unfortunately, I did try to run a game and stream at the same time, but it was damn near impossible, so I just couldn't try it on the system. But if you tried to stream from a capture device, yes, you could actually stream from the Intel Atom N450, which is actually surprising. When it comes to the other areas, really, Windows 7 was the slowest but the easiest to use. Windows XP and Linux were about on par with each other, and the reason for this is, well, Windows XP and software support for anything that wasn't running older games and titles, it's really hit or miss now, as the software is getting rather old. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love using Windows XP myself, but you've got to factor in the security issues and things like that that people will moan about you for, and it was generally just something where you had to spend more time configuring things than Windows 7 that was actually quite easy to get up and going. Then you have Linux, and Linux was nice to use, don't get me wrong, but the OpenGL support, which was meant to be better, as well as driver support in general, was a little bit all over the place and scattered. See, the Intel GMA 950 is supported absolutely fine, but its big brother, the Intel GMA 3150, one of the ones included on most end-of-series Atom chips from this era, well, you know, there's still a few people contributing to the Mesa driver overall, but really, I spent so much time jumping through hoops that I didn't really need to get things running, that I just felt it wasn't, you know, nice to use. Overall, once it was set up, it was definitely the speediest operating system to get into grips with, but overall, setting it up, it was a bit of a pain in the arse. So in conclusion, the Intel Atom N450, one of the last of the old Atoms. With its ancient single-core design, weak integrated graphics and all that jazz, it was never really intended as a powerhouse. But it sold well, and you know what? For 5.5 watts of pure power of a potato, well, whatever you really want to call this, it isn't half bad. I mean, let's be honest, it did everything we needed it to do. It did low-end video playback, and I mean, the new ones aren't half bad. I mean, the new ones will even play Skyrim in 480p, which is a damn sight more than this could ever hope to do. Really, though, that's not what this is about. This isn't about comparing these old ones to the new ones. It's about saying, you know, these old ones existed, and we bought them. And how much performance did we actually manage to squeeze out of it? Well, usable performance. I mean, don't get me wrong, these Atoms were kind of an innovative idea, but at the end of the day, they are extremely weak. And I'm not exactly recommending you rush out and buy yourself a 10-year-old Atom chip just because you saw me use one, because, well, they aren't worth it. But they do work, so if you've got an old netbook lying around and you need something to get you by, you know, it'll play all the games you need it to, if you only play games from over 10 years ago. I mean, it plays Quake 3, it'll play OpenTTD, it'll play all the games that I actually play. So, you know, if you actually want a little low-end setup and you've got one of these lying around, no, maybe set it up somewhere, maybe enjoy it for a little bit, because these Atoms, you know, we hated them on release, but we bought them, so why don't we see what they can do? I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm sorry it's been so long since uploads, but they'll be back to being normal schedules now, and thank you very much for watching. Good night. So I think there should be one more video going live this week, which is just a small one I made when I was away. about the original Xbox, so that should be going live. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone has enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in that next video that'll be going live. Like and subscribe if you want more like this, and I'll see you then.